Welcome to the GSMC Pets Podcast, the show that caters to pet lovers of all kinds. We'll talk about pets on social media, pets doing amazing things, and how to take care of the pets in your life. Whether your pet is a dog, a cat, a llama, hamster, reptile, or something more exotic, you'll find educational and entertaining information on the GSMC Pets Podcast.
GSMC Pets Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Alex Fletes. Now, as I'm sure you're aware, there's a lot of chaos and disorder and unfortunate things happening in the world. And in the midst of these trying times, there's always something a little light in the darkness that happens. And today I wanted to talk about just something fun and interesting that I thought people would really get a nice enjoyment out of. So one thing I love are animals that live in extreme environments, animals that live in places that we don't typically get to view simply because they aren't exactly inhabitable for people, or they live in ways that humans wouldn't really have a good enough experience to be able to take in. Now, I've already talked about zoo animals and how their living situations can either better their lives or they can be treated as, inhumanely. It depends on the type of zoo. Thankfully, a lot of places have rectified this dilemma of zoos and have really changed the face of how people view zoos. But today I wanted to talk about a zoo, apparently the Shed Aquarium, my mistake. And obviously because of the virus outbreak right now, as of the time of this podcast, that a lot of people are required to stay home. And well, home is for the animals, this zoo, by the way, the aquarium, so a lot of the animals in the aquarium get the rare opportunity to roam. And I think that's always great, getting to see video of animals roaming the habitats. And this really cute video has been going around of the penguins at the Shed Aquarium. That's S-H-E-D-D, Shed Aquarium. And the penguins are actually getting to roam around with the trainers. They're guiding them around, letting them explore, see the other animals. And it's honestly really, really adorable. These animals are simply roaming around. They're going in areas they don't usually get to go into and actually interacting with other animals of different size and species through the glass, and it's really adorable to get to see. And it's really fascinating that animals really they are just as curious as we are, but their curiosity is straight curiosity and wonder, and it's really fascinating to get to observe animals do this kind of thing. It's super cute. You see this emperor penguin just kind of like waddling around through the habitats. It goes up to a big glass exhibit, and it like starts interacting with like the animals inside of it, and they interact back. That's honestly really fascinating to me, that animals do acknowledge each other, even if they're completely different or they're not in places that they would normally get to interact in the wild. It's really cool. And you wonder with penguins, is it okay for them to be out here? There aren't a lot of places that have climates that suit penguins. For the most part, they're going to be fine in these environments. The main thing is that because they're at professional environments that help them stay alive, that help them thrive, they're going to do fine because they're going to be well taken care of. But for very, very rare cases, there are animals that need to be completely secluded in their environments because, that's the only way they'll really survive. Because if they're not in those environments, then they're going to get sick. They're gonna not do well. Obviously if you take a fish out of water, it's not gonna do well on land in the desert. Same deal, some animals are going to need to be in that very specific environment for survival. And that's kind of around the area that I'll be talking about today, is just the natural survival of animals, things you can look at and consider, is this something that works for me? I've seen a video way back when of people who had penguins, and they were living in their house, splashing in their bathtub. But I've actually done some more information on those kind of things, and a lot of times those are from rehabilitators who don't have the complete methods to rehabilitate something long enough, but giving them something to splash around in to feel like they're back in the water is always important. But that is still a good question. Penguins are not very good pets. Penguins are going to require a lot of care, very strict diets, very, very strict diets, because, it's not like, penguins aren't like, say, they're not omnivores. They're technically carnivores, because they eat a lot of fish, but it depends on how you define fish, as meat or not. Some people actually don't consider fish meat. But, penguins have to be very, very careful with what they eat as well. A lot of sea creatures do have very specific diets. So it really is cool that we get to see something rare like this. I think last week we talked about a bunch of sea otters or river otters that were playing on the bridge with a local zoo. They just kind of showed up and started playing. This is kind of like that, just the random opportunities to see animals just being themselves without a care or worry. That's honestly something that I think everyone could benefit from, is getting to see that. So if you get a chance, look it up. It's pretty adorable. It's honestly really adorable. I think one thing we don't know too much about, though, are the frozen animals, the winter tundra, and just exactly what it takes for them to survive, and the sort of beauty and majesty that come with creatures like this, and even animals on the opposite spectrum, the desert dwellers. I'll definitely have to do a podcast on that one day. But for right now, I want to talk about these frigid friends, and especially how amazing it is. It's a shame because people think, oh, penguins get the short end of the stick because they have short legs and they can't fly and they really don't have much survival skills. It's like, yeah, but you know what else? They live in the Arctic where the winds are some of the highest and most, honestly, the most deadly. If you've ever sat in frozen winds, they are nasty. And these penguins can endure that. And along with that, they are incredibly fast swimmers. So they may not fly in the air, but they fly through the water. The way that their feathers are made, it's like got a special oil coating on them, and they're like really thick feathers. So honestly, you may think that a parka or something will keep you warm. No, those guys are warm. It's really impressive how we don't consider those ends of the spectrum. That penguins are speedy little creatures. They fly through the water, but at the same time we have some crazy birds, albatrosses, eagles, birds of prey who just glide and soar through the air. Well, those guys won't do that well up north in, the tundra. They won't do that well when the winds are unfavorable, or they really won't do that well when it comes to the water. Yeah, actually, eagles can swim, but they are not aquatic birds. And penguins definitely have them outmatched if they were on penguin turf. Penguin turf. But honestly, that is one of those things that you just kind of have to say, wow, animals are amazing because they're all designed and have adapted to the environment that they live in. An animal that, we register as, man, that thing is slow. Yeah, it may be slow, but when you put it in its natural environment, that thing has some seriously amazing skills that you wouldn't have expected. back on my first podcast, we talked about Fiona the hippo and how a big old trotting hippo can go about 19 miles an hour, I believe, and this thing glides and bounces through the water. That is some of the amazing things about animals, is that they can surprise us in many, different ways. And that's just kind of what I want to discuss about how surprising some of these animals are and what the advantages are of what they're given. But before we get into that, we're going to take a quick break and hear a word from these messages. So please stay tuned and enjoy. We'll be right back.
Are you tired of the same old news? Are you sick of the seemingly endless political spin and negativity? The GSMC America Still Beautiful podcast is a weekly news podcast covering all the top positive and uplifting news stories. We cover stories that will inspire, uplift, and remind you of the good in the world. Tune into the Golden State Media Concepts America Still Beautiful podcast to get all the great and positive news stories of today. Download the GSMC America Still Beautiful podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Messages. So we previously just talked about Arctic animals, penguins, the freedom they get in the zoo right now due to the virus lockdown, and just how amazing some of these creatures are that we really don't get in contact with. So let's continue with that. So when it comes down to animals in special environments, the Arctic tundra, the frozen wastelands, these places have some of the most resilient and probably the most majestic of these animals. I mean, in most days, if you see a white animal anywhere in forests, in, mountains, you see them anywhere that you would be, more than likely that animal is not going to survive very long. Simply because animals adapt to their surroundings. They find that the need to have dark, muddy colors or, browns, having greens, things that blend into their environment works well for them. But animals if they're in the wild like that, if they're white, they are going to die. That's more than likely a fact. It's not 100%, but, a white mouse is more than likely going to be spotted than a gray mouse. Just saying, because, one can blend in around rocks, the other one sticks out like a sore thumb. It's just sort of how nature works. And not all animals can handle this, can do anything about this. Sometimes it has to do with albinism, if they're a bit of an albino creature. That's unfortunately a product of not having enough of the filaments to produce. And in some cases, it's also just an animal that just got, unfortunately, the wrong pattern. That's just sort of how nature works. But when it comes to creatures that are in the Arctic tundra, they need those beautiful white patterns. And most of them will have a nice white pattern as well. Polar bears, Arctic foxes, and a lot of birds will have white. If they are any type of avian that lives in the Arctic tundras, they're going to have more bright colors unless they are birds of prey. Birds of prey will usually have darker colors. And it's interesting simply because, I don't know how often you actually see this happen, but it's really interesting when you get to see animals take full use of that camouflage. If you've ever seen, say, an Arctic fox, this is actually a really, really fun thing to get to see. But an Arctic fox, which are adorable, but some foxes do this, but Arctic foxes do this very frequently. They will actually do a really high hop and dive right back into the snow. It's actually really adorable to get to see happen. They will just jump up and then dive right back into a big pile of snow so they can hide, or so they can like ready to ambush something, or if they just need to like hurry up and scuttle away, they do that. It's actually really adorable, and it's really cool. Because of that perfect white fur, they can hide, and it's really difficult to not see them coming. Same thing with wolves. Wolves, while not, diving in, they will hide, and, the second when it gets so quiet and you just kind of hear like a low rumbling or growling, you know that something's about to happen. And fun fact, very, very fun fact, an indie video game that came out pretty recently called, Super Lucky's Tale actually did borrow from wolves and foxes, that dive mechanic. So if you are a video game fan and you enjoy retro platformers, Super Lucky's Tale actually does take that whole jumping up in the air and diving back down into the snow or into the dirt, from actual foxes. So that's actually a really, really fun fact to me, as much as I love video games, knowing whenever things take inspiration from real life. But the camouflage is really fascinating to me as well. When you stop and think about camouflage, you think about probably lizards that can change their color, or you think about birds or little mammals that can blend in with the ground. But snow camouflage is very underappreciated simply because we as people don't typically use it. If we as people needed camouflage, and we lived in more snowy areas, you'd have to wear a lot of white coats. You'd have to be someone who stays in a lot and your skin pigment goes bright. So someone who has darker pigment in their skin wouldn't fare as well. So that's a really fascinating fact to me. But we don't need to rely on that. Yes, in, battle we would need camouflage, but that's why we have camouflage clothing. But we don't use that on a regular basis, so we don't worry about that kind of thing. But, hey, animals that use that camouflage, they better have a nice thick coat of it, and they better have a good color for it, because, if you're green and you live in, if you're green and you live in the Arctic, you're gonna stick out. If you're dark brown, you're gonna stick out even worse. But at the same time, if you're Snow White and you're living in the Amazon jungle, you're going to get probably one of the first picked out. It really is unfortunate that, that's something they can't really control. Only a small amount of creatures can control that. But the Arctic camouflage is definitely one of my favorite types of camouflage as well. Because unlike other forms of camouflage that have to be like scales and ridiculous or even outrageous colors, Arctic foxes and Arctic creatures get a nice beautiful white coat that just feels natural, and it's pretty amazing too. But Arctic wolves, although they do need the white camouflage, they also don't always need it if they don't live in completely snowy areas though. Because rather than camouflage, they'd rather just need thick fur. There is some interesting aspects about the Arctic area that I really do find fascinating, but that's more or less a later down the line topic. But one thing we haven't talked too much about are the sea creatures of the Arctic. Primarily, there aren't a lot of big fish that do take a lot of Arctic priority. There are some. But a lot of fish can't survive in that. It's actually really, really cool to get to see the divide in oceans. I believe the Arctic Sea and the Arctic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, actually you can see that nice, divide. You automatically see, boom, here's where the waters change, hot, cold. It's like a big, dark line. It's really cool to get to see. And at that point, there are creatures that are like, nope, can't do that. Nope, not touching that. Nope, get me away from there. And that's really cool. I think it's really cool how everything just kind of has a place where it needs to go, and it's just perfect to set lines and stuff like that. But yeah, you're not gonna find any small fish out in the Arctic Ocean. Not any small trout or I'm talking river fish. Those things will die if they go even into the big ocean sometimes. But there are more husky, thicker fish. That's why if you see shows, I don't know if it's still on, but The Deadliest Catch, they go out to more rough sea water, sometimes out in the Arctic too, to catch really specific fish, because they're not things you're going to find just in the ocean. Sometimes you have to find things that are like really deep in the Arctic because they're meatier fish, or they come bigger because they have to have more mass to live longer. It's really interesting. But animals like penguins, orcas, narwhals, we'll definitely want to talk about that, live in these Arctic environments, and they have a lot of interesting mechanisms to do that. One thing you find that a lot of creatures in the Arctic don't particularly need is speed. And that's for good reason. I'll definitely explain as to why a little bit later. However, when we stop and look at it, the differences in environments really are a sight to behold. You know, we as people, you know, a lot of us, you know, if we live in America or even, you know, more rural or metropolitan areas in the world, we're not going to see a lot of these crazy animals. But if you live somewhere where maybe it's more intertwined with nature, you might get to see more uncommon animals. You might get to have more interesting experiences, and you might know some of these things. But it's not very often that the majority of the population gets to see or experience these kind of things on a regular basis. So, yeah, I can talk about forest animals and, you know, why they do this, what they eat and stuff like that, because they're right in my own backyard. But I have to go and do research on some of these creatures and, like, realize that explains why they do that. That explains why they look like that. And it really is something to learn. But we're going to take a quick break once again, and when we come back, we're going to talk some more about the ocean life of the Arctic and some really fun facts you might not know related back to media as well. But for right now, enjoy these messages.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
I hope you guys enjoyed those messages. So, talking about animals and their unique traits in their extreme environments, aka the Arctic, we want to discuss more about some more aquatic-based animals, and I have just the one for you, the narwhal. Fun fact, the narwhal was actually thought to be extinct, or rather a not real creature for a while. Stuff of myth and legend, but it is actually a real creature. A large, almost whale-like creature with a big horn on its head. Another fun fact, it is also known as the Jedi of the Sea, and can use the Force to move large icebergs. That is not a real fact, but I thought you would enjoy that. So, with the narwhal, it's really a mystery, almost a, well, oddity of the ocean world. I mean, essentially it's just a big whale with a horn on its head. You know, what really makes a narwhal so special? Well, that's really something to be said. I think one thing about the narwhals is that simply it's different. You know, sure, we do have animals out here in the, more, Pacific or even the Atlantic Ocean's also freshwater, but in the oceans that, the swordfish, a lot more animals that have these weird designs to them. that make very little difference or sense, but they do make some sense. But it's interesting about these creatures is that, well, they have a big horn on their head, but they're basically whales. I mean, they actually were thought to be endangered for a little while, but now they're doing great, doing really good, actually. I mean, with these creatures, they actually aren't as big as whales, but they're very similar to the size of whales. It says usually they're going to get close to around maybe 13 to 15 feet. They are actually a lot smaller than whales, but when it comes to their horn, or actually a tusk, it's actually a type of tooth, apparently. It's actually a type of tooth, and honestly, I'm not really quite sure as what it'll use it for other than, maybe ramming into something. But to be completely honest, the tusk doesn't seem to have that much of, doesn't really seem to have that much of a purpose. They're really interesting creatures, though. Whenever we look at these creatures and we think, well, there's a big, unicorned whale out there. It's like, it's a narwhal. It's like, we can look at this and say, yeah, it's normal. It's nothing that special. It still is a fairly interesting creature in the fact that it exists. It just sort of seems like, hey, we have a whale. Now let's make a sharp whale. But in some instances, I think it does make sense, though, that for such a big creature, but still not even the biggest creature, it needs to be both intimidating and it needs to be, I guess the word would be compact. Because if they were just whales, matching the size of orcas or killer whales or any of that stuff, then there would be a large competition between the two of them, and I actually think the horn would be a big hindrance. But since narwhals are actually a bit smaller than whales to an extent, it actually does give them somewhat of a fighting chance. Think of it kind of like the underdog, or someone, the guy who's like the scrawny weak guy against the, big tough bully, in a sense. They need some kind of edge to really take care of themselves and also to add something different. Now, what is interesting about these creatures, other than that, is that they have had a huge, and I mean a huge impact on culture as well, mainly culture and media. So narwhals, honestly, if you've lived under a rock for the past 2-3 decades and you've never been on the internet, then it's hard to believe that you may not have ever heard about, the narwhal memes, or, just known about all the interesting facts about them. There was actually a whole song written about them. And, people are just saying narwhal. Like, there's some people who don't know what a narwhal is, but they know that a narwhal exists, or vice versa. It's kind of like whenever someone tells you, hey, did you know that there's a South Korea? It's like, there's more than one Korea? Or there's a North and South Dakota, or East and West Virginia. It's kind of like there's more than one. It's one of those things that you just kind of hear, but you don't really expect. It's pretty funny to me. But other than that, narwhals, they don't have that much, really difference, other than they're just more like smaller whales. They're really fascinating creatures regardless, though, and if you get the chance to see one, I mean, I definitely say go for it. Take full advantage of seeing these things, other than that, believe it or not, narwhals can actually be taken out by some creatures, like, for example, polar bears and even walruses. So again, they're not huge. In fact, you can kind of think of it like it would be difficult for say, an attack dog or a hunting dog or a wolf to take out a bear, but it wouldn't be that hard for a wolf or an attack dog or a bigger creature to take out a smaller bear, or even let's just say a deer. it's kind of that kind of comparison, which is really fascinating because, they're still huge creatures to us, but it's interesting. It's interesting that even though that's the case, these things still are taken down by smaller creatures. Heck, even killer whales will group together and overpower narwhals. The Arctic terrain is not a friendly place. You should know that right now. Narwhals, they're not endangered, and that's just kind of how nature goes. It's not something we completely need to worry about, but they are fascinating creatures that deserve time to be acknowledged and observed if given the chance. They, just like whales, breathing holes, they have a lot of features. Just, again, they got a big tooth horn. It's fascinating. It really is. But other than that, some of the Arctic creatures just kind of have, I guess, a unique way of doing things. Sea and land don't seem to completely separate the ecosystem of the Arctic's areas. And that's pretty fascinating that almost a majority of the Arctic mammals actually do reside in the water. And other than, there's not a ton of notable fish, but, you have a lot of birds, you have a lot of mammals, vertebrates, you have a lot of creatures that spend most of their time in the water because that's where they find their source of nutrients. Think about if you had wolves that were just jumping into the water because they could find just as much prey and meat in the water than they could on land, if not even easier. It's really, really interesting. Whereas here, land creatures rule. If they have the ability to stalk a prey, they'll find a prey. They'll search pretty hard and track down something right around the corner. It's really important to get to know what it's like being in different environments and how different creatures thrive and what kind of things you can expect to see in those types of environments, which, again, nice trip to your local zoo or nature institute will definitely help you out with that. Ask a professional, and they can give you much more detail than I ever could in this short 1-hour podcast. But it's still something I find incredibly interesting and something I love to take some time to explore and learn about. When it comes to creatures, trying to find something new about animals will definitely broaden your horizon. Little things you'll learn about creatures here, there, everywhere will really open up the world to your knowledge and expertise. But with that, I'm going to let you sit on that for just a moment while I take another quick break and we get a word from our sponsors. So please enjoy these messages and we'll be right back.
Is weird, odd, strange, or just plain bizarre is really your cup of tea? Then the Golden State Media Concepts Weird News Podcast will give you that fix. Can't believe it? Well, listen for yourself as we deliver the strangest news you definitely won't find on CNN or Fox. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Weird News Podcast.
You're still sticking around with us. So we've been talking about Arctic animals today, their environments, their adaptations and such. We previously just had a nice little conversation about the narwhal, the Jedi of the sea, swimming in the ocean, causing a commotion, because they are so awesome. But now, let's talk about another creature. I believe that you all probably have heard of it. It's a little creature, not doing too well, but is definitely one of the most majestic creatures in the Arctic. We're talking about the polar bear. when it comes to the topic of land and conservation, polar bears are definitely one of the top that comes to your mind, and for good reason. Now, there is a list of how animals are classified in their current state. Are they endangered, or are they not endangered? Are they extinct? The far end of safety is least concern, meaning no problem with them. We don't have to worry about pigeons. Pigeons aren't going anywhere. But some animals that didn't make it, say saber-toothed tiger, are no longer with us, hence they are extinct. There is a nice line and different categories between that. Now, the polar bear isn't exactly endangered, but it is vulnerable, meaning that there is a chance of these creatures going through a major change in some time. But there are ways to help mitigate this. However, that's a bit more beyond my knowledge and scope at the moment, but I can say doing better at maintaining the health of the planet is definitely one of them that we can do. But again, I'm not a specialist in that specific area. But one day I think I might know someone who does. But back on topic, the polar bears, which are very fascinating creatures in themselves. One major thing that I find interesting about polar bears are their claws. So with regular bears, and I actually really love my local institute, my nature institute, because of this, they actually do have some examples of things like how big bears are and their biology. They have nice molds and replicas to show this, and one of my favorites was a claw mold for a sun bear, I believe. And sun bears and a lot of North American bears actually do a lot of climbing, so their claws have to be longer and more curled, and have to be able to really grab things. So like, if you look at like a grappling hook, or you look at like a climbing hook, they're really curved so they can really hook into something and reach around edges. Whereas a polar bear is a bit different. While it does still have claws, they're a lot shorter, and their paws itself are actually more segmented and stubbier, because it actually gives them better traction in the snow and on ice. So think of it this way. If you used a hook or a series of hooks to climb up something like a tree or a building, you want longer hooks that grab onto things a lot tighter. But if you're grabbing onto ice, you're not going to use long hooks. You're going to use stronger, thick hooks that can break through the ice. Or in this case, if you're using shoes, like snowshoes, you need smaller, thicker shoes that can hold on tighter to the ice and stick right into the surface so you can walk. So polar bears, their paws are actually made more like snowshoes. Not one-to-one, but they are smaller and thicker rather than long and curled and clawed. It's really fascinating. So polar bears are really interesting also in the fact that, well, they are creatures of isolation. People think that they are territorial. They think that they roam in large groups to, maintain land or something. Not really. Polar bears are relatively creatures of isolation, where, when they become adults, they live on their own, they hunt on their own, take care of their own or themselves, and they only really socialize on, every once in a while with, other polar bears. They're pretty cool. They're cool with other creatures most of the time, and to be completely honest, they just, they're like, whatever, I got my own thing to do, I'm gonna do my own thing. It's kind of cool. I can honestly appreciate that about the animal, that sometimes animals that live in large herds don't do very well, or there's more like a hierarchy that keeps them having to maintain a certain order or a certain level of consistency. But here it's just like, I live my life, I do my thing because I'm a polar bear. So when it comes to polar bears as well, I also find that, besides that, they actually aren't very aggressive creatures. They are aggressive, but rather a lot of reported polar bear attacks or bear attacks in general actually happen because the animal was spooked by something else, like a person or by something that caused them to be aggressive. Whereas they're not necessarily aggressive by nature, only when on the hunt. But it's kind of interesting that that's usually what'll happen. But along with that, I do want to take a small detour and talk about one of my favorite polar bears in fiction. If you have any kids, or maybe yourself are a lover of animation, there's a really great show called We Bare Bears, a show about 3 bear brothers who live in the city. And one of the bears, they're each a different species of bear. We have a grizzly bear, a panda bear, and a polar bear. Goes by the name of Ice Bear. And Ice Bear is a bear of few words, and actually is a little bit more of a creature of isolation too, which I think really works well for his character, because, at first I thought, oh, this is just a whatever character, but actually looking up more research on polar bears, it definitely fits the character of Ice Bear, being more of a creature of habit and self-interest as opposed to a herd creature, which I really, really do find interesting for polar bears. And also, We Bare Bears is actually a very fun show, and if you like bears and cutes and a lot of fun stuff, it's a good series. Now, here's one thing that a lot of people might not know too much about, is that polar bears specifically, have underlayers of fur. So they'll have their normal layer, and then they'll have an extra layer of fur underneath. That kind of explains how they stay so warm. Sort of like whenever your mom told you, it's cold outside, so make sure you dress in layers. You need to put a long sleeve over a short sleeve shirt, and then after your short sleeve shirt, under your long sleeve shirt, then you put your jacket on, you wear long socks and short socks, because all those layers will help keep you warm, so that way, if it's cold, freezing, you don't get sick, and you're able to just do well out in that cold, unforgiving environment, because cold weather is very unforgiving. Also, if in captivity, you might see this, but as a polar bear gets older, they tend to lose that white in their fur, which the fur itself isn't actually white, it's transparent. Go figure. But, if you were able to show that, definitely, please show me that. That'd be awesome. But eventually it starts becoming more of a yellow. And when kept in captivity, they're actually might actually turn a little bit green too, because it's a little difficult to maintain a polar bear up close, and sometimes algae grows in the fur, which isn't something that you usually have to deal with in the Arctic, but it just happens. It doesn't mean they're sick, it just means that they got some goop in their fur that they might need to get out at some point. But it's really fascinating. Polar bears, they are swimmers. They are swimming bears. Bears can definitely swim, but polar bears, if you actually take the time and look at the difference between a polar bear and a grizzly bear, grizzly bears are a lot bigger. They're a bit slower, not as slow, but they are a bit slower because of their stockiness. And they don't do as much swimming as polar bears typically will do. So, like I mentioned earlier with the long claws versus the short stubby claws, the long claws of grizzly bears aren't, ideal for swimming, because their paws are going to be sort of one thing, and then their claws on the end sort of just become really long, good for scooping things up and, slashing or ripping things. Whereas polar bears, like I said, have more segmented paws and are good for standing on icy terrains and for really, holding onto the snow and everything like that. So there is a difference. And polar bears definitely have a bit more of a longer body as in comparison. It's really interesting to look at with these characters. But it's definitely something to look around. Also, apparently they can swim about 4 miles an hour. I'm pretty sure that's much faster than humans, unless you're an Olympic swimmer. But I am... Oh, my mistake. They swim 6 miles an hour. They can run about 4 miles an hour. Either way, they are definitely very, very fast in the water. They're definitely creatures that know how to and have really taken advantage of the environment they live in. And I find that really fascinating, because that's just how it happens in the wild. They adapt to their environments and they thrive. But with that being said, we're going to take a quick break once again, and when we come back, we're going to talk about some traits of more Arctic thriving animals and just what you should know, and maybe some interesting places you can look to learn more about these type of creatures. But until then, stay tuned after these messages.
the Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast, the show that gives you advice on everything travel. We explore places you've always wanted to go, as well as giving tips for traveling in those places. We'll give you advice on the best sites for travel tips, information, and discounts. Join us as we travel the world, explore cultures, and meet new people. The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast has got you covered. Download the GSMC Travel Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Once again, thanks for sticking around. So we had a nice discussion about polar bears, and rather than talking about reduction in their environment, we're actually talking about the physical attributes of a polar bear and what you should look for and why these creatures are so amazing. But now I want to talk a little bit more about other creatures, their physical attributes, and what you should be on the lookout for. So we had a nice discussion regarding penguins, polar bears, narwhals, and there are several other creatures out there that have equally great abilities and physical capabilities, and I just kind of want to highlight some of them and just sort of really understand what they mean. So one of the big things you'll find about aquatic creatures in the Arctic is that they tend to be a bit bigger as well. Along with that, obviously their speed and swimming prowess are going to be some of the top notch, but you'll actually find that a lot of the creatures in the Arctic are mammals. You know, sure, there are a lot of fish as well, but the diversity of fish sort of outweighs the diversity of fish isn't that great out there. You know, you'll find a lot of bigger fish, probably tougher fish than you'll find in warmer climates. In warmer climates, a larger variety of fish can live in all different sizes. But in smaller climates, in colder climates, you're going to find you're very limited because bigger creatures that can survive in that warm will definitely do much better. But now it's mainly the predators that take priority out there. Some I didn't get to talk about were elephant seals. Very fascinating and, shall we say, very cuddly creatures. They're interesting simply that they are very large. They are seals. And I think I've explained already the difference between a seal and a sea lion, but seals are typically more stockier, and they don't have as much of a speedy design, but they are very interesting creatures. They are similar to walrus. You know, if you've ever seen a walrus, they are basically seals with long, sharp tusks. But elephant seals are kind of like the cows of the Arctic area, as in, while they are somewhat dangerous, they're also just kind of, there. But even then, it doesn't mean they are not dangerous. Also, they call them elephant seals because they do have, somewhat elephant-like trunks. So, enjoy. Now, when it comes to these creatures, a lot of, creatures in the frozen tundra aren't fast. You know, even then, I've mentioned Arctic wolves and foxes, but they don't live, say, straight up near the water areas, but they'll actually live more in areas that have snow. So Arctic wolves and foxes might live near the frozen icy tundras, but they'll live more or less in forested areas or places close to that, but they don't live close to the water. Simply because they do better with land creatures, but they have a lot of same advantages as these creatures. Now, you may have noticed that, say, aside from the polar bear, elephant seals, walruses, narwhals, these creatures don't have one of my favorite features of a animal, which is their camouflage, because they simply don't need it. They are hunters, or they are creatures who survive by other means, so they're not hunting to stalk prey, rather they swim for their prey. So if they did have a brighter color in the water especially, they would not do well. They'd be sticking out like a sore thumb. I think an interesting example of this is while orcas, are definitely the big boys of the sea out there. Orcas are killer whales, by the way, if you just need a refresher. They have a black and white color scheme. Now, this might seem, I guess, counterintuitive, but it's actually not. The colors of the water, specifically deep in the waters of the Arctic, you may think that it's blue or that it's bright. It's not as much as you'd think. It's actually a lot darker and dimmer. So the constant shifting of icebergs and the whites and the contrasting blacks or darks in the water actually do give the orcas a bit of a tactical advantage out there, because they sort of blend into the background at a distance and you might not notice them until it's too late. And they're actually pretty fast too. They're not speed demons like, say, a seal or even penguins, but they are very fast for their size. Along with that, it just kind of it's really interesting to watch them actually do what they do, simply because everything just kind of moves for them. But they're actually tactical creatures as well. And they use different mechanics as well. I've actually seen videos of a orca actually flip a seal into the air before it caught it, or to disorient it so that we could hunt it easier, rather than, say, hunting it down and just attacking it like a shark or any other type of predator. It actually uses its body to its advantage. A lot of other creatures, something you may know is, or may not know, is that a lot of creatures out in the frozen tundras have sharp teeth. Even the less threatening ones like elephant seals or walruses, or a lot of those creatures will have sharp teeth because a lot of animals, specifically like if they're hunting fish, are again thicker and a little bit tougher, so they need something that has more, they need to be able to grip onto their prey and rip it. So that's kind of an interesting factoid as well. In my experience working with sea lions, they also did have somewhat sharp teeth, but not to the same level of degree as a seal or any of these other creatures as well. Because a sea lion that lives in California doesn't need as much ripping power as a seal that lives in the Arctic, because things are a lot rougher and a lot more thick and resilient out there. So it's all about adapting to the environment. But it is really amazing. It's really fascinating. So one thing I really have been avoiding, because I've just been kind of biding my time on this one, because this is a really fun example. So if you know me well enough, besides being a lover of animals and all that, I love video games. And I want to take a moment to relate some interesting factoids of video games and real life. And I always go back to one of my favorite video game series, Pokemon. And in the Pokemon series, there is a very unique ability that certain Pokemon have. And like when I say certain, I mean like 2 or 3 of them. And it's a really good ability called Thick Fat. Now, I think if I remember correctly, the Pokemon Snorlax and only the Pokemon Mega Venusaur can learn this ability. And what was special about these abilities is that they actually mimic real life, because Snorlax and Mega Venusaur are very large creatures, and they both would typically have some problems with extreme heat or extreme cold. They gave these Pokemon that ability to deal with that, because due to the Thick Fat ability, any moves that have extreme heat or extreme cold, say fire-type moves or ice-type moves, are reduced by half. And that's actually why this is amazing, because in real life, not Pokemon, but animals such as, let's say, seals, even polar bears, they have a thicker layer of fat or extra protection to insulate them from the heat. And in some cases, animals that live in warmer climates are bigger and then can retain their temperature better, such as we also have, like, say, the camels, which are able to restore water longer because of their thicker stature. And it's really fascinating to see those kind of parallels in real life. There are several parallels between media and television that really do show the level of connection and realism in a fantasy setting. And Pokemon is definitely a good place, so I might be coming back to that a bit more. But along with that, I find it fascinating that the way that the fat's distributed does work. It does, keep them warmer. It's sort of like someone who's lived in these colder environments longer. Like, oh, this is nothing. This is a pretty warm day considering things. But they might also be used to having, a thicker layer of warmth. Or they might actually have a bigger stock to them. It does happen pretty frequently with me and some of my friends who are much bigger than me, who have no problem with cool temperatures, but they suffer in the heat because they haven't regulated their heat and body temperature properly, unlike how animals do. And that's really, really fascinating. I find that the way animals have adapted to their environments and the way that they're able to show that in these sort of pieces of media are really amazing. But, like always, it's time to take a final break before the end of the show and our final segment. I hope you all have been enjoying, and I please hope that you take a moment to relax and enjoy these messages. See you in a bit.
Want to find out what movies to go see? Then check out the GSMC Movie Podcast. It's your ticket to the latest movies, whether it's a new blockbuster event, romantic, comedy, or action flick. This show has got it all covered. They talk some what to go see now, don't bother, what's hot on Netflix, and everything in between. That's GSMCpodcast.com/movie-podcast. When it's all about the movies, it has to be this new show. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
For sticking around. I hope you've been enjoying. Today we've been talking about Arctic animals, some factoids about them, including media, the way that their bodies have adjusted to the environment, and just other really interesting facts. So ending this episode today, I really just wanted to talk more about these animals, talk more about how amazing it is when animals are able to adapt to a different environment, and just exactly what it is that people can do to both be aware and to live in sort of a copacetic way. One of the main things is obviously, I highly doubt that there's going to be a lot of people out there who live the exact same way as they do. Occasionally there are people who live in these extreme environments as well. Perhaps they live near the Arctic. Perhaps they live up north where it possibly is common to see polar bears. One of the biggest things is to obviously keep it clean. If you live anywhere, try keeping the environment clean, making sure that things are safe, and making sure that you can enjoy the environment without needing to leave your essence behind. You really shouldn't leave the area any different than it is when you got there. If anything, leave it a little bit better, almost like you were never there. Simply because when animals start becoming more used to humans being around, it changes it can change their biology, it can change their physiology, it can change a lot of the way they view things. If you actually look at things like areas where in Japan or in other areas where, like, say, monkeys or deer have gotten used to humans coming and feeding them, the second humans stop, it does force them to become scavengers, and they roam into places they shouldn't be. There was a recent report of large gang of monkeys, I'm talking like a town's worth of them, bursted into the streets because there were no humans coming to feed them, and they were searching because of this whole virus issue. Same thing with deer in the Nara, Japan forest, that they roamed out of the forest because humans weren't coming in to feed them, so they were searching for food in other ways. And this is dangerous for them simply because they become dependent on people. And while it's really difficult to change everything back to how it used to be, making sure you don't make too much of an impact on anything else is one of the better options you can do. Simply because when things start changing in this regard, whenever animals start becoming super dependent on humans, then it will also change the landscape of the environment. It'll also start changing where humans can and can't go, perhaps expanding the reach or reducing the reach of human exploration, and that can be a very good or a very bad thing. I think definitely one of the best examples are of people with the whole toilet paper issue, is that people coming in taking like 100 rolls of toilet paper for no apparent reason. And it's like, if you take what you need over what you think you need, and more than you need, then you're honestly taking too much, and then other people are going to suffer for it. Whereas, same issue with nature, the more you take from it, the less you're leaving back for others. And that's definitely not a good practice to keep going with, simply because we take a lot more than we need. We leave behind what we don't need, and then that leaves others to have to feed on those remains. One other really important thing is that these are wild animals. Very rarely have any of these animals become domesticated. Walruses, seals, polar bears, a lot of these creatures don't typically become domesticated simply because there's no reason to, and they wouldn't do very well in captivity, or rather they wouldn't do well in domestication. I can't see someone having a domesticated walrus or a domesticated elephant seal for like anyday use. It's one thing having domesticated wolves or huskies, because they're derived from dogs, and dogs have become our best companions. But that's like a 1 in a million thing. Not every animal should be our companion. Rather, we can live alongside these animals so long as we're not interrupting on their environment. It's really difficult to do that too, simply because people are naturally curious as well, but also people naturally take and don't give back enough either. So that's definitely one of the major things, is don't take more than you need. That fish you probably hunt for, well, they hunt for it too. If you take all of it, they get nothing. And there are other places, other things we can do. It's just kind of crazy that this even needs to be said, but we don't need to impact the world more than we already have. And that's okay. We can survive without that. We can survive on much less, but it's really important to also learn. It's important to learn what's needed. It's important to learn these facts about these creatures and how well they're able to adapt. Because not only can we learn about their environment, but we can learn more. We actually do learn quite a lot from observing these animals. I mean, do you think that just because we, look at a problem and say, I think we can solve it like this? It's a lot of trial and error, and sometimes even our own modern inventions and creations are derived from animal-like inspiration. A lot of people who've invented scuba gear or, even sometimes breathing apparatuses or important tools that we use every day are derived from studying other forms of marine life or flying contraptions, planes, and mobile, cars and things like that have some form of inspiration, whether known or not, from animals. Things like wind resistance and drag, we learn from watching animals that we just kind of pick up. So even then, getting the time to learn about them is just as important as what they provide for us or what we can take from their environments. So definitely take that time to learn more about how they live. Perhaps you'll learn a thing or two. Perhaps you'll learn more about yourself as well. It's really important. And if you can think of any other ways that you can learn from a creature, learn how they adapt, then it's definitely worth it. If you've learned anything from listening to me or learned anything, is to take some time to go and learn, to research, to observe. And that's honestly one of the best things you could do. You might pick up something unique. You might pick up something that you honestly didn't expect. Because we don't need to take everything. We don't need everything that's being offered. And honestly, nature becomes more amazing when we just leave it alone. But the more we keep impacting it and adding changes and, sticking our finger in the soup that is, nature, then we just add too much of ourselves and we take away the majesty of nature. And it's sad. On the bright side, there are a lot of good things that we do as well. And in fact, we can also improve on nature. But just because we can doesn't always mean we should. And unfortunately, sometimes we do a little too much. So hopefully this podcast can help you find that nice balance. Take the time to learn more about our friends in the frozen wastelands or the heat-stricken barren lands or anywhere that something lives. Definitely take the time and study these things. If you have the chance, go to your local nature institute and learn about these animals. Ask a lot of questions. Curiosity isn't just for kids either. As an adult, you should take the time to use your knowledge to affect the world, especially when it comes to nature and all of our awesome vertebrate, invertebrate, sea-dwelling, reptilian, avian friends, and anything else that we don't even know about yet. But, as always, I'd like to thank you all for listening to the GSMC Pets Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. Please, definitely, if you enjoy what you're listening to, please consider subscribing to this podcast. Also, if you would like to follow us on social media, on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, that would help us out a lot. And leave a comment if you like what you heard today. And as always, thank you, and have a great day.
You've been listening to the GSMC Pets Podcast, part of the GSMC Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcasts on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all of the shows from the GSMC Podcast Network. From movies to music, from sports to entertainment, from business news to weird news. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's podcast.